My name is Ethan, and if there's one thing I've prided myself on, it's being a provider. For years, I worked tirelessly to ensure that my wife, Laura, and I lived comfortably. I didn't grow up with much, so when I had the chance to build a stable life, I threw myself into it completely. Long hours at the office, skipped vacations, and careful budgeting were my reality. All of it was worth it, at least, that's what I told myself. Laura was the opposite of me in every way. She was outgoing, charming, and effortlessly social, always the life of the party. Her friends adored her, often dropping by unannounced for drinks or dinners. I didn't mind at first. I liked seeing her happy. But as time went on, I noticed a pattern. While I was working late to cover bills, Laura and her friends enjoyed the comforts I provided without a second thought. At first, I brushed it off. Marriage is about compromise, right? I told myself she'd eventually see the effort I put in and reciprocate. But the red flags became harder to ignore. Her friends would make offhand comments during their visits. Things like, "Oh, Ethan's working again? Poor guy never gets to enjoy life." Laura would laugh, sometimes adding, "That's his choice. Someone's got to pay the bills." It stung, but I stayed silent. After all, I loved her, and I wanted to believe she loved me too. Then there were the little things. She'd come home with shopping bags, claiming they were on sale, even when I just mentioned cutting back on expenses. Her nights out with friends became more frequent, and she dismissed me as boring when I asked to spend time together. Still, I kept my head down and focused on providing. I thought my dedication would be enough to prove my worth. But looking back, I realized I was blind. I ignored every sign, every moment of disrespect, because I was too scared to confront the truth. Laura wasn't the partner I thought she was. As the years passed, her selfishness became more apparent. Her friends treated our home like their personal hangout, and Laura encouraged it. I'd come home from work to find them sprawled on the couch, drinking wine I'd paid for and laughing as though they owned the place. "Relax, Ethan," Laura would say when she saw my frustration. "You're always so uptight. Just enjoy life for once." But how could I? I was the one holding everything together while they acted like entitled guests in my home. Despite it all, I stayed. I kept telling myself things would get better, that this was just a rough patch. I wanted to believe in the woman I married, the woman I thought I knew. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was being taken advantage of, and Laura didn't care. As I sat at my desk one evening, reviewing bills that seemed to grow larger every month, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. Not just physical exhaustion, but emotional. I was tired of being the only one trying, the only one sacrificing. I didn't know it yet, but this feeling would mark the beginning of the end. Christmas has always been my favorite time of year. There's something magical about the season. The warmth of home, the comfort of traditions, and the chance to take a break from life's relentless grind. This year, I had hoped for a quiet, peaceful holiday with Laura. I envisioned us sitting by the fire, exchanging thoughtful gifts, and reconnecting after months of feeling distant. That hope carried me through my long shift on Christmas Eve. The office was eerily quiet, most of my colleagues already home with their families. I stayed late to finish a project, determined to give Laura the best holiday possible. As I walked out into the crisp winter air, clutching a small gift bag with the necklace I'd bought her, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of optimism. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was lit up like a Christmas card. Twinkling lights adorned the roof, and the warm glow of the windows hinted at a festive scene inside. But as I stepped through the front door, the illusion shattered. Laughter echoed from the living room. Boisterous, unfamiliar laughter. The scent of alcohol and takeout filled the air, not the comforting aroma of a home-cooked holiday meal. My heart sank as I turned the corner and saw the scene before me. Strangers lounged on my couch, drinks in hand, laughing loudly as if they owned the place. Laura sat at the center of it all, her head thrown back in laughter, completely at ease. But what struck me most was the man sitting beside her. He was comfortably draped in my chair, the chair I'd bought years ago with my first big bonus, his arm casually slung over Laura's shoulder. My stomach twisted as I took in the scene. "Ethan, you're home," Laura exclaimed, her tone more surprised than welcoming. "What is this?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling with confusion and anger. Oh, don't be so dramatic, she said, waving me off like I was an inconvenience. It's just a little gathering. Lighten up. I turned to the man in my chair. And who is he? Laura exchanged a quick glance with him before responding, her voice dripping with condescension. This is Ryan. He's a friend. A friend? I repeated, my voice rising. What kind of friend moves into my house, sits in my chair, and— Oh, for God's sake, Ethan, she snapped, cutting me off. Stop making a scene. Ryan is staying here for a while. He needed a place to crash, and you've got plenty of space. It's no big deal. No big deal? My voice cracked with disbelief. Laura, this is my house. Our house. And your house? She interrupted with a bitter laugh. Ethan, please. You're just the guy who pays the bills. Don't act like this place is some sacred temple. Besides, it's Christmas. Be generous for once. Her words hit me like a slap in the face. I stood there, clutching the gift bag in my hand, feeling like a stranger in my own home. My eyes moved to the hallway, where a pile of my belongings sat haphazardly against the wall. Clothes, shoes, and even my pillow were stacked as if I were an unwelcome guest being evicted. What is this? I asked, pointing at the pile. Oh, that? Laura said dismissively. Ryan needed space, so I had to clear out some of your things. Don't worry, I didn't throw anything away. The room erupted in laughter as her friends found the situation amusing. I could feel their eyes on me, mocking, judging, and enjoying my humiliation. I turned to Laura, my hands shaking. How could you do this? How could you disrespect me like this? Laura rolled her eyes, taking a sip of her wine. Ethan, stop being so sensitive. It's just a few things. You're overreacting. Overreacting? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. She smirked, clearly unfazed. You're always so dramatic. Relax. It's not like you were using the bedroom much anyway. That was the final straw. Without another word, I turned and walked out the front door. The cold air hit me like a shock, but it was nothing compared to the chill I felt inside. I sat in my car, staring blankly at the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. Laura's words echoed in my mind. You're just the guy who pays the bills. The betrayal was so blatant, so brazen, that it left me breathless. I had spent years sacrificing for her, working myself to exhaustion to provide the life she wanted. And this was how she repaid me? Tears of anger and humiliation stung my eyes as I gripped the steering wheel. I wanted to storm back into the house, to demand answers, to make her see the pain she had caused. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Laura had made her choice, and it wasn't me. I started the car and drove away, leaving behind the home I had built and the woman I had once loved. Christmas was supposed to be a time for family, for love, for togetherness. But for me, it had become the day I realized I was done being the selfless provider. I don't remember much about the drive that night, just that I needed to get as far away from that house as possible. The Christmas lights strung across neighboring homes blurred into streaks of color, and the radio played festive songs that felt like mockery. I wasn't heading anywhere specific, just away. Away from Laura, from her lover, from the humiliation that clung to me like a second skin. When I finally stopped, I found myself in the parking lot of a modest hotel on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered, casting a dull red glow over the entrance. I sat in the car for what felt like hours, the heater humming softly as my thoughts raced. How had it come to this? I thought about the years I had poured into that marriage. Every overtime shift, every sacrifice, every compromise. It had all been for her, for us. And yet, Laura had reduced me to nothing more than a paycheck. A nameless, faceless provider who didn't even deserve the dignity of a proper bedroom in his own home. The hotel clerk didn't ask many questions as I checked in, and for that, I was grateful. I paid in cash, not wanting to leave a trail, and climbed the stairs to a small, clean room that smelled faintly of disinfectant. The bedspread was an unremarkable beige, the curtains heavy and dull, but it was mine. As I sank onto the bed, the reality of my situation hit me like a freight train. I was homeless, cast out of the home I had built, not by circumstance, but by the very person I had trusted most. I wanted to scream, to cry, to punch something until the pain subsided, but all I could do was sit there, staring at the blank wall in front of me. The hours stretched into the early morning, and my thoughts began to organize themselves into a brutal clarity. I replayed the events of the past few years, seeing them now for what they truly were. The dismissive remarks, the constant belittling, the way Laura had prioritized her friends and her whims over our marriage. It had all been leading to this. I had ignored the red flags because I wanted to believe in the woman I had married, but the truth was undeniable now. Laura didn't value me. She never had. The realization was painful but freeing in its own way. For so long, I had clung to the idea that I could fix things, that if I worked harder or gave more, Laura would finally see my worth. But I understood now that nothing I did would ever be enough for someone who didn't want to see it. For years, I had let myself be disrespected, humiliated, and taken for granted, all in the name of love. But that love, the love I had for her, and the love I thought she had for me, was gone. It was time to stop sacrificing myself for someone who didn't care. By morning, my decision was made. I packed up my belongings, what little I had brought with me, and left the hotel. I didn't go back to the house, didn't even drive down the street. Instead, I found a quiet cafe and opened my laptop, beginning the process of reclaiming my life. The first thing I did was block Laura's number. Her texts had started coming in early, each one more dismissive than the last. Where are you? Don't be ridiculous. You can't just run off like a child. We need groceries. Come home. Every message made my blood boil, but I didn't respond. She didn't deserve an explanation. Next, I began separating our finances. It wasn't an easy process. Laura and I had shared accounts for years, but I was determined to regain control. I canceled credit cards, froze joint accounts, and opened a new account in my name only. The final step was finding a lawyer. I wasn't sure what my options were yet, but I knew I needed to protect myself. Laura had already crossed every line of decency. I wouldn't put it past her to try to take more from me if she could. As I sipped my coffee, a strange sense of calm washed over me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking back control of my life. It was a small victory, but it was mine. That night, back in my hotel room, I allowed myself to think about the future. It was daunting, the idea of starting over, but it was also exhilarating. For so long, my life had revolved around Laura and her needs, but now I had the chance to focus on myself. I thought about the things I had given up for her. The hobbies I'd abandoned, the friends I'd lost touch with, the dreams I'd put on hold. Maybe now, I could start reclaiming those parts of myself. The thought brought a small smile to my face, the first genuine one in what felt like years. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. I was done being the selfless provider, the man who gave everything and received nothing in return. From now on, I was putting myself first, and it felt damn good. The first thing I did the next morning was shut down every connection Laura might have to me. I didn't leave a trace, didn't answer a single message. I blocked her number and her social media accounts, cutting off the lifeline she had always relied on to pull me back into her world. For years, I'd been the dependable one, the man she could count on no matter how badly she treated me. But not this time. This time, I wasn't going to be her safety net. At first, her messages had been dismissive, almost mocking. This is childish, Ethan. You can't just disappear. Stop sulking and come home. We have bills to pay. But as the hours stretched into days, her tone shifted. When her texts stopped delivering, she resorted to emails. Ethan, I'm serious. Where are you? The electricity bill is due. Are you really going to make me handle this? This is your responsibility. You can't just leave me to deal with everything. Reading her words, I felt a mix of anger and vindication. She wasn't worried about me. She was worried about the life of convenience I had always provided. It was never about us. It was about what I could give her. And now, she was starting to realize that I wasn't going to give anymore. The days passed quietly for me. I stayed in my hotel room, working remotely and slowly piecing together the next steps in my life. It felt strange, liberating even, to make decisions without considering Laura's needs or demands. I reached out to a lawyer, explaining the situation and beginning the process of filing for divorce. It was a step I had avoided for far too long, clinging to the hope that Laura might change. But the events of Christmas had shattered that illusion. "This isn't uncommon," the lawyer said during our consultation. "A lot of clients stay in toxic relationships because they think things will improve. The important thing is that you're taking control now." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and determination. Taking control was exactly what I needed to do. Back at the house, things were falling apart. Mutual friends and acquaintances began reaching out, relaying snippets of the chaos I had left behind. "Hey, Ethan, I heard you and Laura are having some issues," one friend texted cautiously. "She's been complaining about you disappearing. Everything okay?" I ignored the messages, refusing to be drawn back into the drama. But the updates kept coming. "She's freaking out, man," another friend said during a phone call. "She's saying you abandoned her and left her to deal with everything. Her lover and her friends aren't exactly helping. Sounds like things are getting messy over there." Messy was an understatement. Laura had always been confident that I would come back, that I would swoop in and fix whatever problems arose. But as the days turned into a week, reality began to set in. Without me, the bills were piling up. The refrigerator was empty, the utilities were on the verge of being cut off, and her so-called friends were starting to realize the party was over. I imagined the scenes unfolding in that house. The arguments, the finger-pointing, the panic as they tried to figure out how to maintain the lifestyle I had provided. It was poetic justice in its purest form, but it also left me feeling a strange sense of pity. I didn't pity Laura's lover or her friends. They were opportunists who had taken advantage of my generosity, and they deserved whatever consequences came their way. But Laura, despite everything she had done, a part of me still felt sorry for her. She had made her bed, but she had no idea how to lie in it. For so long, she had relied on me to be the foundation of her life, and without me, that foundation was crumbling. By the end of the week, the messages from mutual friends took on a more urgent tone. "Laura's saying the lights are out at the house. She's really struggling, Ethan. Are you sure you don't want to at least talk to her? She's calling everyone, trying to figure out where you are. She even tried to get your work info from someone. She's desperate, man. Desperate." That word stuck with me. Laura had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of our relationship. But now, she was floundering, and it was because she had never bothered to value the person who had made her comfort possible. I didn't respond to any of the messages. This time, I wasn't going to swoop in and save her. Sitting in my hotel room that night, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's demands. I wasn't scrambling to fix problems I didn't create or sacrificing my happiness to keep someone else satisfied. I thought about the life I wanted to build, one that wasn't defined by Laura's needs or her friends' expectations. I thought about the freedom I felt in taking back control of my life, and I realized I had no intention of ever giving that control up again. Laura could figure out her own way forward. I was done being her safety net. The silence was deafening. For days, I hadn't responded to a single call, email, or message from Laura. I blocked her number and stopped opening messages from mutual friends. I knew the longer I stayed away, the more desperate she would become. And desperate she was. The updates from friends and acquaintances trickled in, painting a picture of chaos unfolding in the house I had left behind. Laura's lover, Ryan, and her group of friends were no longer the carefree companions they'd been when I walked out. The weight of unpaid bills and the realization that there was no financial cushion had caused fractures in their little circle. "Laura and Ryan are fighting non-stop," one mutual friend texted. "Apparently, the water's been shut off, and there's no food in the fridge. It's bad over there." I read the message with a detached sense of satisfaction. It was the justice I hadn't planned, but knew was inevitable. By the second week, Laura's once confident messages turned frantic. She found ways to send emails despite being blocked, resorting to new email accounts and even social media DMs. "Ethan, please come back. We need to talk. I messed up, okay? Just come home so we can figure this out. You're being cruel. I'm begging you, please." The guilt she tried to stir in me barely registered. I'd spent years shouldering her emotional manipulation, sacrificing my needs for hers. This time, I wasn't giving in. From what I heard, her lover Ryan and the group that had taken over my house didn't last much longer. With the bills piling up and no financial support in sight, the arguments escalated into shouting matches. One friend described a particularly volatile fight that ended with Ryan storming out of the house with his suitcase, leaving Laura behind. He said something about not signing up to play house with someone who couldn't even afford the basics, the friend recounted. Can you believe that? The guy mooches off her, then leaves her when things get tough. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. Ryan had thought he'd hit the jackpot with Laura, but as soon as things became inconvenient, he bolted. They deserved each other. Laura was left alone in a house that was falling apart. Without me to handle the bills and maintenance, everything was unraveling. I heard that the power had been shut off, followed shortly by the internet. The yard, once pristine, became overgrown, and the house itself began to deteriorate from neglect. She's calling everyone for help, another friend said. She even tried to borrow money from me, but I told her no. I'm not getting involved in that mess. Laura's pride was crumbling along with the walls around her. The woman who once mocked me for being just the guy who pays the bills was now scrambling to keep the lights on. Her attempts to reach me became more desperate. The emails and messages were no longer filled with accusations or demands, but with pleas and apologies. Ethan, I know I hurt you, but I need you. Please come back. I can't do this without you. I don't even know where to start. I love you, Ethan. I always have. I'm sorry for everything, but I didn't respond. Her words felt hollow, an act of survival rather than genuine remorse. During this time, I focused on building the future I wanted. I met with my lawyer, outlining the terms for our divorce and ensuring my finances were fully separated from Laura's. The lawyer was efficient and empathetic, guiding me through the process with a professionalism that made me feel supported. She has no legal claim to your assets, the lawyer confirmed. Given her infidelity and the circumstances, you're in a strong position to ensure she doesn't benefit further from your hard work. It was a relief to hear. For years, I had given her everything, but now, I was taking it back. The final breaking point came when Laura sent a message that was clearly meant to manipulate me. Ethan, I'm sick. I need you. Please don't abandon me. At first, I felt a pang of concern, wondering if there was any truth to her claim. But the years of emotional games made me wary. I decided not to respond, knowing it was likely another ploy to draw me back into her web. Friends began reaching out, saying they'd heard rumors that Laura wasn't doing well. Some even tried to guilt me into checking on her. She's struggling, Ethan, one friend said. You were her rock. Maybe just talk to her? I shook my head, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. She made her choices. I'm not her safety net anymore. As the days passed, I kept my focus on planning the next chapter of my life. I had started looking for a new place to live, something far from the chaos I had left behind. The thought of a fresh start filled me with hope, a reminder that I was finally free to prioritize my own happiness. Laura's escalating desperation was no longer my problem. I had spent years giving her everything, but now, I was giving myself the one thing I had denied for too long: peace. The updates about Laura and the house continued to pour in from mutual friends, and with each one, the picture became clearer. The life she had built on my sacrifices was crumbling. She's completely alone now, one friend told me during a phone call. Her lover is gone, and her friends stopped visiting. No one wants to deal with her mess. The mess was more than figurative. The house, once a pristine symbol of our shared life, had become a shadow of its former self. The lawn was overgrown, the trash bins overflowing, and the power and water had been cut off. Laura was living in squalor, the luxury she had taken for granted slipping through her fingers. She's been asking around for help, another acquaintance said, but no one wants to get involved. Everyone's tired of her drama. Hearing these accounts, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was satisfaction in knowing that Laura was finally facing the consequences of her actions, but there was also a lingering sense of pity. This was a woman I had loved, a woman I had once believed in. Seeing her brought so low was a reminder of how far we had fallen. One evening, While sitting in my new apartment, a small but cozy space I had rented to start over, I received a message from an old neighbor. "You won't believe what's going on at the house," they said. "There was a huge fight the other night. I heard shouting, things breaking. It sounded bad." Apparently, Ryan, her lover, had returned briefly, but it wasn't to make amends. According to the neighbor, he had come to collect some belongings he had left behind, and the argument that ensued was nothing short of explosive. "They were screaming at each other in the yard," the neighbor recounted. "He called her a liar and said she'd ruined his life. She was shouting back, blaming him for everything. It was a disaster." The fight ended with Ryan storming off for good, leaving Laura alone once more. With Ryan gone and her friends nowhere to be found, Laura was forced to face the reality of her situation. The house was a disaster, the bills unpaid, and her once glamorous life reduced to a grim existence. "She's been trying to sell things," another mutual friend told me. "Furniture, jewelry, anything she can get money for. But no one's biting." It was poetic justice in a way. The same material possessions she had flaunted as symbols of her superiority were now little more than dead weight. I couldn't help but reflect on the irony of it all. Laura had once mocked me for my dedication to providing for our household, treating my sacrifices as nothing more than an expectation. Now, without me, she was floundering. But despite the satisfaction I felt, there was also a lingering sense of loss. I thought about the woman I had married, the promises we had made to each other, and the life we had once envisioned. Those memories were distant now, overshadowed by years of disrespect and betrayal, but they still lingered. She brought this on herself, I reminded myself whenever the pity began to creep in. This is the life she chose. Around this time, I received another update from a friend who still lived nearby. "I passed by the house today," they said. "It looks abandoned. The lawn's a jungle, the trash is piling up, and there's no sign of life. It's like she's just given up." The image stayed with me, a stark contrast to the home I had once worked so hard to maintain. It was a symbol of what Laura had let slip through her fingers, a life she had destroyed with her own selfishness. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding my own life. I met with my lawyer to finalize the divorce paperwork, ensuring that Laura would have no access to my finances or future earnings. "You're making the right decision," the lawyer said. "This is about protecting yourself and moving forward." Hearing those words, I felt a sense of closure beginning to take shape. For so long, I had been trapped in a toxic cycle of giving and sacrificing for someone who didn't value me. Now, I was finally breaking free. The last update I received about Laura was almost anticlimactic. "She's still there," the neighbor said, "but it's like she's a ghost. No one sees her anymore. The house is falling apart, and she doesn't seem to care." It was a fitting metaphor for our relationship. Laura had always been more concerned with appearances than substance, and now, with her world unraveling, the facade was gone. Sitting in my new apartment that evening, I allowed myself to reflect on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the chaos. It had all led to this moment. And while the pain was still fresh, there was also a sense of peace. I had escaped the chaos, reclaimed my dignity, and started to rebuild. Laura's unraveling was a reminder of what happens when you take people for granted, when you prioritize selfishness over love and respect. I didn't hate her, not anymore. But I also didn't pity her. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. And I was finally free. A week passed without any word from Laura or updates from our mutual friends. I thought I had reached the end of her chapter in my life, but life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. One evening, as I sat at my desk organizing the final paperwork for the divorce, my phone buzzed. It was a voicemail notification. I hesitated for a moment, knowing the only person who could have left a message was Laura. Against my better judgment, I played it. Her voice was weak, trembling with emotion. "Ethan, I'm not well. I've been sick for days, and I don't have anyone else to call. Please, I need you. Just come home, even for a little while." I felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger, doubt, and a trace of guilt. Was she truly sick? Or was this another one of her manipulative ploys? I replayed the message, listening for any sign of deceit, but her tone was convincing. Still, I wasn't ready to let my guard down. Laura had played me too many times before, and I wasn't about to be drawn back into her chaos without evidence. I decided to wait. If she was genuinely sick, there would be signs. People would notice. Sure enough, the next morning, one of my old neighbors called with news that sent a chill down my spine. "The paramedics were at your house last night," they said. "Laura looked terrible, Ethan. I don't know what's going on, but it didn't look good." My initial reaction was disbelief. Laura, the woman who had always thrived on appearances, reduced to such a state? It didn't feel real. But the neighbor's voice carried no hint of exaggeration. "She was on a stretcher," they continued. "Two of her friends were there too. They didn't look much better. I think it was some kind of overdose." Overdose. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I tried to picture the scene. Paramedics rushing into the home I had once worked so hard to build, Laura lying unconscious among the wreckage of her choices. It was a grim image, one that filled me with a mix of anger and sadness. Part of me wanted to ignore the situation entirely. Laura had made her bed, and this was just another consequence of her reckless behavior. But another part of me, the part that had once loved her, couldn't shake the need to know what was happening. I decided to go to the house, not out of obligation, but to see for myself what had become of the life I had left behind. When I arrived, the house was eerily silent. The overgrown lawn and overflowing trash bins painted a grim picture, but what struck me most was the emptiness. The home that had once been full of noise and life now felt like a hollow shell. The front door was unlocked, swinging open with a creak as I stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of neglect and something unidentifiable. The living room was a mess, discarded bottles, stained furniture, and remnants of the wild parties that had replaced any semblance of a home. My stomach turned as I walked through the house, each step uncovering more evidence of how far Laura had fallen. The bedroom, once a shared space full of memories, was the worst. The bed was unmade, sheets tangled and dirty, with empty pill bottles scattered across the nightstand. It was here that I truly understood the depths of Laura's decline. As I stood in the middle of the chaos, my phone buzzed with a message from another neighbor. "She's at the hospital now," it read. "I thought you'd want to know." I didn't reply, my mind racing as I processed everything I had seen. Back in my car, I sat in silence, staring at the house. I felt a strange mix of emotions, pity, anger, and an odd sense of closure. This was the culmination of Laura's choices, the life she had built without me. For years, I had been her safety net, the one who cleaned up her messes and ensured her comfort. But now, as I looked at the wreckage of what was once our shared life, I realized there was nothing left for me here. Laura's sickness, whether physical or emotional, was beyond my ability to fix. I drove away without looking back, my resolve stronger than ever. Laura had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. I didn't hate her, but I couldn't save her either. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the life I was building for myself, the freedom I had reclaimed and the peace I had found. Laura's voicemail replayed in my mind, but this time, it felt distant, like an echo from a past life. I knew then that I wouldn't return to the house, no matter what. Laura's story was no longer mine to be a part of. I arrived at the hospital early the next morning. The fluorescent lights of the emergency entrance flickered faintly, casting an eerie glow over the quiet chaos inside. Nurses moved briskly through the halls, their expressions calm but focused. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I knew I needed answers. The moment I stepped up to the front desk, a wave of hesitation hit me. Why was I even here? After everything Laura had done, after the betrayal, the humiliation, the abandonment, why did I still care? But despite my anger, there was still a lingering thread of responsibility, a sense of duty to the person I had once loved. "I'm here to check on a patient," I told the receptionist, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "Laura Rivera." The woman behind the desk scanned her computer screen before nodding. "She's in room 217. I see you. Visiting hours are limited, but you can go now." "I see you." The word made my chest tighten. Whatever had happened to her, it wasn't minor. As I walked down the sterile hallway, each step felt heavier than the last. When I reached room 217, the sight before me stopped me in my tracks. Laura lay motionless on the hospital bed, her face pale and gaunt. The woman who once prided herself on her appearance, who spent hours perfecting every detail, was now a shadow of her former self. Tubes and monitors surrounded her, beeping softly in the background, their rhythm a stark contrast to the chaos she had brought into my life. I stood in the doorway, unsure whether to step inside. Then I noticed the other two beds in the room, occupied by women I recognized from Laura's circle of friends. Both of them were unconscious, their faces equally as pale, their bodies hooked up to similar machines. A nurse entered the room, glancing at me briefly before checking Laura's chart. "What happened to them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The nurse hesitated before answering. "Overdose. It appears they mixed alcohol with prescription drugs, painkillers, benzodiazepines. It's a miracle they survived it all." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. This was what Laura's life had come to: reckless parties, substance abuse, and near-death experiences. I moved closer to Laura's bed, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and disbelief. Her once glossy hair was limp and unkempt, her manicured nails chipped and raw. It was hard to reconcile this broken woman with the one who had mocked me, belittled me, and treated me as disposable. The nurse spoke again, breaking the silence. "She's stable for now, but it'll be a long road to recovery, physically and emotionally." I nodded, unsure of what to say. As I stood there, memories of our life together flooded my mind. The good, the bad, and everything in between. I thought about the nights we'd stayed up talking about our dreams, the promises we'd made, and the person I believed she was. But I also thought about the betrayal. The way she laughed at my sacrifices, moved her lover into our home, and dismissed me as just the guy who pays the bills. The anger resurfaced, sharp and hot, but it was accompanied by something else, a deep, aching sadness. She had done this to herself. I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, a voice stopped me. "Ethan." I froze, my hand on the doorframe. Her voice was weak, barely audible, but it was unmistakably hers. I turned back to see her eyes half open, clouded with confusion and pain. "You're here," she said, her words slurring slightly. I didn't think you'd come." I didn't respond, unsure of what to say. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please. I'm sorry. I need you." The anger flared again, but this time, it was tempered by a sense of finality. I had given her every chance, every ounce of patience and understanding, and she had squandered it. "I'm not staying," I said firmly. "You made your choices, Laura, and now you're living with them." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let myself feel anything. Not pity, not regret, not guilt. I walked out of the room without looking back. As I left the hospital, I couldn't shake the image of Laura lying there, frail and broken. It was a sobering reminder of how far she had fallen, how much she had lost. Not just me, but herself. But as much as it hurt to see her that way, I knew I couldn't save her. She had to save herself. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't my burden to carry anymore. Laura's story was no longer mine to fix or endure. Driving away from the hospital, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. I had spent so much of my life trying to be the perfect husband, the perfect provider, only to be met with betrayal and disrespect. Now, I was finally free. Free to rebuild, to rediscover myself, and to live a life unburdened by Laura's toxicity. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was mine, and that was enough. The next morning, as I sat in my small but peaceful apartment sipping coffee, my phone buzzed with notifications. News about Laura and her overdose had spread through our old social circle like wildfire. Friends, neighbors, even distant acquaintances were reaching out to me, all with the same mix of shock, pity, and curiosity. "Ethan, I just heard about Laura. Are you okay?" One message read. "Is it true what happened at the hospital?" "I can't believe it," another said. "Man, I hate to bother you, But Laura's situation is all anyone's talking about, wrote an old friend. I ignored most of the messages, unwilling to get sucked back into the chaos. I had made my peace with walking away, and I wasn't about to let others drag me back into Laura's orbit. Later that day, a mutual friend called, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Reluctantly, I picked up. "Ethan, I'm so sorry to hear about Laura," they began, their tone dripping with concern. I sighed, already weary of the conversation. "What's going on now?" "Well, the whole neighborhood is talking about it. People are saying she was in critical condition, that it was some kind of overdose. And with her friends being involved," the friend trailed off, clearly fishing for details. "She's stable now," I replied curtly, keeping my tone neutral. "That's all I know." The friend hesitated before continuing. "I don't mean to pry, but are you going to help her? I mean, after everything?" I cut them off. "No. Laura made her choices. I'm not her safety net anymore." The silence on the other end of the line was palpable. "Well, I hope you're doing okay," they said finally. "You deserve better, Ethan. Take care of yourself." "I will," I replied before ending the call. Despite my resolve to stay out of the situation, updates about Laura's condition continued to reach me. One neighbor reported that she had been released from the hospital and was back at the house, but her friends were nowhere to be found. "She's all alone now," they said. "The house is a mess, the bills are piling up, and no one's stepping in to help her." It's sad, really. Sad? Maybe. But it wasn't my problem anymore. A few days later, I received an email from Laura. It was long and rambling, filled with apologies, explanations, and pleas for forgiveness. "Ethan, I know I've hurt you, and I don't deserve your kindness, but I'm begging you to give me one more chance. I've lost everything, my friends, my health, my stability, and I realize now how much I took you for granted. You were the best thing in my life, and I was too blind to see it. Please, don't leave me like this. I need you." I stared at the screen, my emotions a mix of anger and detachment. It was everything I had expected, desperation cloaked in regret, a last-ditch effort to pull me back into her world. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the email to my lawyer, asking him to expedite the divorce proceedings. Over the next few weeks, I focused on finalizing the divorce. Every step felt like a weight being lifted off my shoulders. The financial entanglements were sorted, the paperwork was signed, and soon, I was legally free of Laura. The news seemed to hit her hard. I received another voicemail, her voice breaking with tears. "Ethan, please, don't do this. I know I messed up, but I can change. I swear, I can change. Just give me one more chance." I deleted the message without a second thought. Word of our finalized divorce spread quickly, becoming the talk of our old neighborhood. People speculated about what would happen to Laura, about how she would manage without me. Some even tried to reach out on her behalf, urging me to reconsider. "She's struggling, Ethan," one mutual friend said. "I think she really understands what she's lost." "She had her chances," I replied simply. "Now it's time for me to move on." And move on, I did. With Laura officially out of my life, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in years. I threw myself into my work, reconnecting with colleagues and taking on new challenges. I started going to the gym again, focusing on my physical health as much as my emotional well-being. Most importantly, I began to rediscover who I was outside of my role as a provider. I took up photography, a hobby I had abandoned early in our marriage. I spent weekends hiking and exploring new places, finding joy in the simple act of being alone with my thoughts. For the first time in years, I wasn't weighed down by someone else's expectations or demands. As for Laura, her life continued to unravel. I heard through the grapevine that she had sold the house to pay off her debts, moving into a small apartment on the edge of town. She was working odd jobs, struggling to make ends meet, and largely isolated from the friends who had once surrounded her. It was a stark contrast to the life she had once lived, a life built on my sacrifices and her selfishness. I didn't feel anger anymore, nor did I feel pity. Laura had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I felt a deep sense of peace. The fallout from my marriage had been painful, but it had also been necessary. For too long, I had given everything to someone who didn't value me. Now, I was finally free to give to myself, and that, I realized, was the greatest gift of all. The first morning in my new apartment felt surreal. The sunlight streamed through the windows, unfiltered by the heavy curtains Laura had always insisted on, and the air was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in years, I woke up without a sense of dread or the weight of someone else's expectations pressing down on me. This was my space, my sanctuary, and it reflected the person I was becoming. The walls were lined with framed photographs from my hikes and travels over the past few months. Each image represented a step toward reclaiming my identity. There were pictures of serene mountain landscapes, vibrant cityscapes, and candid moments with friends I had reconnected with. Every corner of my apartment told a story of growth and rediscovery. My days were filled with purpose again. Work had become more than just a means to an end. It was a platform for me to challenge myself and pursue new opportunities. I took on projects that excited me, built stronger relationships with my colleagues, and even received a promotion that had been long overdue. But the most significant changes were in my personal life. I had started saying yes to things I'd once ignored: impromptu dinner invitations, weekend getaways with friends, and even solo adventures that pushed me out of my comfort zone. For years, I had put everyone else's needs ahead of my own, but now I was learning to prioritize myself. One evening, I sat on the balcony of my apartment with a glass of wine, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions: anger, heartbreak, relief, and finally, peace. I thought about Laura and the life we had shared. There had been moments of love, moments when I truly believed we could build something lasting. But those moments had been overshadowed by selfishness, betrayal, and disregard. Laura had made her choices, and I had made mine. The difference was that my choices had led to freedom, while hers had led to isolation. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself embracing new connections. One of my coworkers, Rachel, had become a good friend. She was thoughtful, kind, and grounded in a way that reminded me of what healthy relationships looked like. We started spending more time together, and while I wasn't rushing into anything, I couldn't ignore the spark between us. She saw me for who I was, not as a provider or a fixer, but as a person with hopes, dreams, and flaws. For the first time in years, I felt seen. One afternoon, I received an unexpected letter from Laura. It was handwritten, the pages filled with her familiar looping script. "Ethan, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to say everything I couldn't before. I'm sorry for what I did, for the way I treated you, for the pain I caused, and for taking you for granted. You gave me so much, and I threw it all away. Losing you has been the hardest thing I've ever faced, but it's also been the wake-up call I needed. I know I can't undo the past, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better, not for anyone else, but for myself. Thank you for everything you gave me, even when I didn't deserve it. I hope one day you can forgive me. Laura, ****. I read the letter twice, feeling a mix of emotions: closure, sadness, and even a hint of gratitude. It wasn't about forgiving her or forgetting what had happened. It was about acknowledging that we were both moving forward in our own ways. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, deciding to leave it there as a reminder of how far I had come. The life I was building now was one of intention. I wasn't rushing into anything, but I also wasn't holding back. I was learning to trust myself again, to embrace joy without fear of judgment or betrayal. On weekends, I explored new hiking trails, capturing the beauty of nature through my camera lens. During the week, I threw myself into my work, not out of obligation, but because it genuinely excited me. Most importantly, I was no longer afraid to take up space in my own life. As I stood on the balcony one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The journey had been painful, but it had also been necessary. I had learned that love without respect is hollow, that sacrifices mean nothing if they aren't reciprocated, and that true happiness comes from within. The scars from my marriage would always be a part of me, but they no longer defined me. They were reminders of my resilience, my growth, and my ability to move forward. I raised my glass to the future, a future that was mine to shape, free from the weight of the past. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something better,